Welcome to a special bonus episode of The Investigation. I'm Chris Vlastos, Senior Executive Producer at ABC News. I'm joined by Matt Mosk, Senior Investigative Reporter, and a special guest today is James Meek. He's been a member of our investigative team, but has been tracking and covering the Julian Assange story since it broke in 2006. Today, we're also joined by a special guest, Sean Langan, who has worked with James over these past few years. And at the center of it all, Julian Assange. There are very few people that know him, but the man we're talking to today has spent at least 50 hours over the last year inside that Ecuadorian embassy as recently as last month. And we're going to get an insider's look inside that Ecuadorian embassy. Sean Langan is a well-known war documentary filmmaker who was taken hostage by the Taliban in 2008. He is also an ABC News contributor, and he joins us by phone overseas.
He likes to talk about this stuff and dance around whether WikiLeaks did business with the Russian intelligence services, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd tell you a number of things. I met him, I think, when WikiLeaks first broke out onto the world stage, when they were releasing the various cables and army files, and he was a very different person, and he at that point thrust into the limelight, as I imagine it would affect most people who are suddenly front page news in every country in the world. There was this sort of, what I imagine, a computer geek, not with the greatest social skills in the world, clearly, into that kind of hacking world, what some people might consider slightly conspiratorial. The man I met in the last few weeks is very different. And one thing that struck me is that line that, through suffering one learns empathy. And he looked me in the eye, which I don't think when I first met him 5 years ago, this sort of computer nerd didn't make eye contact with fellow humans. And just before I ask you a question about the jet being there or what the Americans were planning, where I felt really sorry, where there is this human element to the story, because whether you like what WikiLeaks do or you don't, or whether you like him as a person or not, and I know there are very many camps divided on this, he looked me in the eye and I could sense, and he said it, he had this real fear now, which I think is about to be realized, of spending the rest of his life in a supermax federal prison in America.
And what does he fear happening there? What will happen to him? What does he say?
Well, there was two. So first of all, he did say he was worried if he was in a normal American prison being beaten up. And then I said, well, the chances are you're more likely, and this is slightly gallows humor, it didn't really make him feel better. I said, well, don't worry about being beaten up. You're most likely going to be put into one of those federal max prisons where you don't see a soul. And then I really saw in his eyes someone who's just spent 5-6 years inside that confined space, albeit still free, and he's got the asylum. The idea now that he could face the rest of his life in isolation, you can see the toll it's taken on him. And it's an unpleasant thing to see that in any man. So that's hanging over his head the whole time, and I can see real fear, and it's now real. In the years before, I imagine there was a slight impression that it was all a bit of a game. Or people think of these people, they've seen too many movies, so when he does talk, he talks about, Sean, when you've got the CIA after you, NSA, a superpower after you, but in fact, you're sitting in a room surrounded by cameras and listening devices, and it's not melodramatic. It's not some conspiracy movie. That I imagine these organizations and U.S. intelligence organizations are very much focused on him, and it's taken its toll, and he's under great pressure. Whilst we're having lunch, I would ask him these questions about the Mueller inquiry, the investigation, and the charges of Organization 1. Did WikiLeaks collude with the Russians knowingly, and did they cooperate with the Trump campaign team in when to release those Democrat files? He would describe, now, this is my opinion of him and the way he argues. I'm sure he would disagree with my take on it. He seemed to be very strong on things when it suited him, and then rather vague on other things. But he was very strong, and I think this has been borne out by what we know of the Mueller investigation, that he described Roger Stone and Trump Jr. He said, those bunch of clowns, that's his direct quote, those bunch of clowns can conspire and organize this kind of thing. And I suspect that might be correct.
Does he still, Sean, I'm curious if you know, does he still carry with him the sort of value set that he's always had about protecting his sources? Or could he turn around under these conditions and start talking about where some of the material for WikiLeaks came from?
He's very guarded on that, and I think that's. One thing it's this whole 6 years, 7 years inside that embassy. One thing that's been shown is that he's got that sort of character type who's not for changing, not for compromise, and often to his own expense. He's an absolutist, as it were. I'm not sure myself personally, having spent time with him and met the other WikiLeaks people, including Kristen, who's now head of WikiLeaks, how principled it always is. Sometimes they have their own principles. So when you'd ask him direct questions about the timing, the release of certain files, I didn't always feel their answers were as concrete as others might be.
Do you know more generally what he thought of President Trump?
Yes, well, there was the famous quote which I discussed with him, that when a few years ago, at the time of the election, he said, well, the difference between Trump and Clinton was like the difference between cholera and gonorrhea. I was never sure which one he was referring to as gonorrhea or cholera,
but he knows that the president championed him. What was it, James? 137 times.
I believe it was 137.
Yeah.
I think we're going to play some of those bites.
WikiLeaks. I love WikiLeaks.
The sad part is we don't talk about WikiLeaks because it's incredible.
WikiLeaks just released another debate question.
This just came out.
WikiLeaks. Another one came in today. This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove.
In fact, Trump just came out and said that he knows nothing about WikiLeaks. He said moments ago, today, it's not my thing. But what did he say about Trump? Didn't he comment on his marvelous use of social media?
So with me, I think now, when he was talking about these clowns, he used that phrase, these bunch of clowns, and he was specifically referring to Roger Stone at that point and Trump Jr. I got the impression he might include the president in that view. It was not. He certainly did not hold him in high regard, and he was quite dismissive. But in previous conversations I'd had with him, and from my reading, my understanding was, I did see the tweets between WikiLeaks and sometimes direct personal tweets and Trump Jr. My impression is, at that time, he was getting quite carried away and excited to be there in the middle of the U.S. election and in touch with the winning campaign team.
But he was impressed with Trump's ability to use this Twitter, a platform of the millennials. Didn't he call him something like an idiot savant in one of your meetings?
Yes. And so that's why I think when we talk about principles and do they give up sources, I think perhaps he would disagree, but I think he was swayed. One impression I would have, I suspect, the reason why I'm slightly umming and ahhing, one thing I notice when you talk to him, anyone who turns against him, he turns on as though they are traitors. When I brought up how he'd cooperated with media in the past, British and American media or film directors, Oliver Stone or the Guardian newspaper, the New York Times, and then falls out. He inevitably falls out with everyone. And I'm invited to lunch, but if I say anything against him, I'm sure I would be cast out. But my impression is, despite no doubt I will be cast out from meeting him again perhaps, is there's a slight narcissistic thread to this, and I'm sure he was swept up and loved the idea that he was a power broker and he played a part in the U.S. election.
Sean, could I ask you about, the Russians have put out a statement from the Kremlin today condemning his arrest, and I think we've heard when he was, before he was confined in the embassy, that he denied the Russians were involved in leaking material to him. Did he shed any more light to you on his relationship with the Russians or his plans to potentially go to Russia?
over the courses of these lunches, which lasted for 5 or 6 hours, I would occasionally ask questions, and he was happy to talk about them. He denied specific questions. I'll give you just for the quick rush ones. He denied releasing the Podesta Democrat files 2 hours after the grabbing video. He said that's incorrect. He was going to release that, and if you check the WikiLeaks statements, it wasn't to help Trump. On the Russia front, he issued denials on pointed questions. He would say no. When he said no to things, it was more like shutting down conversation than an expansive denial.
But you asked about the communications with Gutzler 2.0, which Mueller, in an indictment of the Russian intelligence operatives, references. And he said something to you about the fact that WikiLeaks were not the only ones talking to that persona online.
Exactly, and that I took to be a non-denial denial, that in fact he was saying yes, that was an admission that he had been in communication with Guccifer too. And his response was, why Reuters and AP and others had been in communication with them, so why pick on WikiLeaks? So that wasn't a direct denial, talking to Guccifer too.
I'm trying to imagine his day in court in the United States, if that day comes. I'm curious, Sean, what you think he will be like when he shows up at the courthouse, if he appears on the stand. What do you expect?
Well, you saw today, briefly, he was sort of shouting out some, I don't want to use the word grandstanding, but he was using that moment in public as he was being taken out of the embassy by the British police and put in the back of their trucks. He was in political mode. I think he'll very much hunker down, batten down the hatches, and will use any court hearing, any public hearing, any chance he gets. He will see it as a political act, and he will make statements, I imagine. Whether one unfairly could call it, perhaps glibly, he's going to be saying things, but I think what I can say for sure is this is not a game for him now. He knows what's at stake, and he could be facing life in solitary. So I think this is now, whereas before, when the first WikiLeaks scandal broke and he was put under house arrest, and even with the Swedish allegations, this is no longer a game for him. You can see that in his eyes. He's really deep down scared of being beaten up in some prisons, but deeply disturbed at the thought of being in solitary for the rest of his life and cut off from his beloved network of WikiLeaks.
Did he discuss the legal indictment? The American indictment is actually only saying that he is being charged with a crime which would only face 5 years in jail, that he gave the passcode or helped Chelsea Manning.
Well, in the last visit, he did tell Sean, Sean shared some of our reporting and our assessment that they were going to try to prove that Assange was not a journalist, his longtime defense, and that he had done things, his methods were not what journalists do. And he seemed to be aware of that, right, Sean? That was their strategy?
It's odd. He often talks about, whatever he talks about, theories, conspiracy, he always does as though it's great assurity, and it's not always clear how you would know, but he has talked of the meetings I've had with him, how when the Mueller investigation is over, that's when Trump will say, you can go after Julian Assange, and then timing-wise, he's as well talked often about the release of Vault 7, the CIA files and previous files, the diplomatic cables, have so angered, whether it's State Department, CIA, Department of Defense, that they were going to go after him, and they were the secret indictments, sealed indictments, and the world would see. And so he's never thought of it as just 5 years, but yes, he was talking about, and WikiLeaks people had been in touch with Chelsea Manning's defense team. I don't know if Chelsea Manning personally, I think she declined to talk to them, but when the grand jury recently taking place dealing with the Chelsea Manning case, WikiLeaks were reaching out, and he was very much aware of the indictments and the questions she was being asked, and relating it to how he could see, and he said, I can see this is where they're going to go after me on this front, that I solicited. I wasn't acting like a journalist or a publisher, that I was encouraging Manning to hack.
He saw this coming. He saw this coming. He knew they were going to come after him.
He sits there and is cut off from the world, but also connected. He was saying an interesting, and I'm not quite sure how he's managed to do it when they cut off his internet. But one thing I do know, when I'm in that embassy, within hours, it's on some YouTube WikiLeaks person talking about Sean Langan visiting or not being allowed in. So, and he's talked about it, and he's somehow connected and able to be connected to all his WikiLeaks supporters and helpers and hackers around the world. So he's very well informed about developments in what's happening in Ecuador. He seemed to be always one step ahead. In fact, the Ecuadorians at one point were accusing him of hacking their system. So yes, he's very well informed in many cases, what the Justice Department are doing, grand juries, and then he spends the rest of his time thinking about these things.
But also seems a little paranoid. You said he thought that some of the Ecuadorian CCTV cameras were piping live video into CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia.
Yeah. The last visit, he said, it was like a development, like, yes, now this is now being, as though before it had been recorded and then sent to the CIA, but he was saying now this is now being fed live to CIA in Langley.
Does he have a plan, do you think, Sean? Does he have some idea of what he's going to do next?
I'm sure the various, I mean, it's with this British lawyer, they've been able to gameplay this rather like the British and the Americans and the Ecuadorians. All sides have been gaming this various scenarios, how this is going to play out, and I'm sure they've all prepared their chess moves well in advance.
Well, to Chris's point, the charge against him in the United States seems to have predicted his next chess move. It precludes a defense that he's a journalist. It doesn't actually go after him on any crime that would allow him to say, I deserve the protections of a journalist. Yeah,
whether it's being fed live or not, I'm sure they well, it's publicly and privately, I think the moves are. And in fact, his lawyers have been in talks with the British and the Australian embassy, the consul has got involved. So I think it's their chess moves are kind of, there has been some level of discussion amongst the various governments involved and his lawyers.
But I think there's always been a story, or there were stories recently, that if this day had come, there'd be a secret trigger of
Dead man's switch.
Dead man's switch. Do you believe that?
That he would unleash some kind of attack, cyber attack on the world in revenge?
Or a trove of documents that have been stolen from the U.S. or other governments that we don't even know about.
That's not something he shared with me. I mean, that's not something he shared with me. He was preparing for this time. So when there was in the news reports out that the aeroplane, and WikiLeaks had tweeted there was a plane which its ID reference that had been involved in some previous
a U.S. government
edition. Yeah. And he was thinking aloud, musing on the possibility as we were having lunch that plane may be there at a British airport waiting to rendition him to America, and of course it didn't happen. And I asked him at that point, well, are you prepared for just in case, the British, the Americans come and you're on a plane? And he said, well, I've made some preparations and I've recorded this. He explained what he has done is there's probably a statement, whether it's audio or printed or visual, I don't know, a prepared statement that they would be able to release in the event that he's incommunicado.
One other story that came up recently, and I think it was the Guardian newspaper, correct me if I'm wrong, about Paul Manafort and his possible visits and meetings that he had with Julian Assange. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So that was one of the examples I was talking about earlier. On some things, when he's on strong ground, he's very adamant. And he's not so adamant when he's, I think, on shifty ground. So he was very adamant saying, and I'm not sure I can use this word, he said, that's bull. I never met him. So he strongly denied that. Where there leaves a doubt is when you then say, well, were you in communication with a third party or an interim? Then he gets vague. So, there was other people. So no, but on the Paul Manafort, he said, there you go, once again, bull media, it's not true, never happened.
Pamela Anderson, I know this is a big U-turn, but what was the nature of their relationship? Do you know?
Well, I mean, yes, I met her with James at the Frontline Club. She was visiting him, regular visit. You know, he's tired of meeting lawyers. All he normally meets is his lawyers, his legal team. And hers was very much a social visit. She would bring gifts. Now, one thing I could answer, you haven't asked me directly, is I do know the Ecuadorians don't allow overnight visits. So I think hers would be a social visit like mine and Vaughan Smith's.
And can I just ask, because just to set it straight, there have been all kinds of reports about the conditions that he's under, and that he's put feces on the wall, or that he doesn't do any dishes, or that there are cats running around feral. Yeah. Can you shed some light just on what it actually looks and smells like in there?
Smells like.
It's like a gilded cage, but a cage is a cage is a cage. So, you know, the actual embassy is a very small little, it's like a local consul, with very sort of old-fashioned 1950s dark Spanish-Mexican furniture. And there's this one room where you sit at a table, and he has this very small bedroom next to it with a small single bed. There was a tiny galley kitchen, and when we go for lunch, he goes into this little galley kitchen, gets the plates, and we eat food, and then he takes the plates back, and he will wash them up.
No feces on the wall that you saw, no cat droppings. It was didn't smell bad.
No, and he there was no smell about him either, and it was odd. That really affected him. This is where, when you're in that psychological batten down the hatches, some things hit you more than others. So he's prepared to be attacked or undermined or criticized by the CIA. But when the New York Times described him having smelly socks, that really hurt him. And
particularly, he was worried about how women would think of him for that.
At one point, he looked me in the eye and he said, "Sean, you know, this." I said, "It's clearly got to you." And he said, "Yeah, I mean, you know, when I look into a woman's eyes, I know she's now thinking, you know, yeah, he raped those women and he's got smelly socks." And I was thinking, well, I think the smelly socks isn't quite as bad as a woman thinking you've raped another woman. But so I was thinking he's definitely on a spectrum where he doesn't quite get things, but that's slightly unfair. But he's clearly genuinely upset at the thought that women and the public, New York Times and others, publishing reports which are untrue. And I think it's fair to say, having witnessed it myself, the Ecuadorians were always very polite with me and Vaughan, and most of the time with Julian Assange. I did, in the last few visits, hear some angry words spoken outside. But it was clearly a deliberate and ongoing attempt at psychological warfare, because every time I'd go for the visit, they would knock on the door and hand him something to sign, and he wouldn't know if what he was being asked to sign would give them the excuse to throw him out. So there was this very much a sort of psychological dark arts going on of how do you force someone out of the embassy.
Well, that's, utterly fascinating, Sean. Thank you for the insight. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, good.